G'day YouTube, welcome back to the channel. Today I wanted to do a quick video talking about a brushless combo that I'm running in my Slayer build here. I was really excited to pick up the Lizard Pro ESC and the Mofo slow motion Pancake motor, but as it was straight out of the box with the factory default settings on the ESC, it was absolutely terrible. I thought I'd made a huge mistake. The throttle response was super jerky. I had no drag brake whatsoever, so I wanted to talk about some of the changes that I've made within the app to fix those issues. Now that it's dialed in, the throttle response is a lot more linear and it's super easy to hit that FOC range to get that super smooth slow crawl. And the transition out of FOC into regular brush mode isn't too bad at all. First issue I had with the ESC was that the drag brake comes set at 0 as a default setting. So I thought, oh, that's not a problem. I'll go into the app and just bump it up to 100%. Going into the app, putting the drag brake to 100% didn't do anything. I messed around with it for ages, couldn't figure out what was going on with it. I ended up having to change the firmware version from, it came set to 2.9. I had to downgrade the firmware version to 2.7, and then all of a sudden I had a functional drag brake. Going back into the app and looking at the firmware versions, 2.9 isn't even on the list anymore, so I don't know if that was like a beta version or what's going on there, but 2.7 is the version that I'm currently using. So the Furitek Furitek app gives you several different profiles for different motors that Furitek produce. For the SMP motor, the slow motion Pancake from Mofo RC, which is a 1700 kV motor, I've selected the Komodo profile because the Komodo is a 1400 kV outrunner. I figured that was probably going to be the closest fit. Next we'll talk about the settings that I've selected in the running menu. I'll show you a screenshot of that in just a moment. FOC range came default at 30%, so that was working fine for me. I've left it at 30%. Start power, which is how much power the speed control allocates to get the motor starting from a complete standstill, I've set that to high. Being a rock crawler, I figure when it's in a bind and you're trying to get that motor started, you want to have a high startup power. The SMP with the Mofo forward-facing mount on an SCX24 transmission, I had to change the direction to counterclockwise. Next on the list we've got the throttle menu. At the top of the screen you'll see calibrate throttle. That's something you'll want to do when the ESC is new out of the box or you've done a reset. You're basically teaching the ESC the characteristics of your throttle trigger, where neutral is, where 100% forwards, where 100% reverse is. There's on-screen instructions for that. That's pretty self-explanatory. The next setting I want to talk about is called neutral forward. It took me a little bit to figure out exactly what that is, but what they're talking about is the throttle deadband adjustment. That's going to be dependent on the transmitter that you're using. I would encourage you to experiment with the different settings. I've got mine set to narrow because that's what felt best to me after I'd set my curves, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Punch setting I've got set to 2. I think default was 3. With it set to 2, the transition out of FOC range and into regular brushless operation is pretty smooth. I'm happy with that setting at the minute. The neutral brake setting, I don't think it's applicable to a rock crawler. I think it's more for something that's free coasting, where you're like a monster truck, where you're actively operating the brakes. So I've left that setting at default, which is 2. Next up is low speed operation. I've got that set at 10%. The low speed is basically the portion of the throttle that's dedicated to FOC or slow crawl operation. If you set that to a higher value, you get a wider band of usable FOC range, but the jump into regular brushless operation is a lot more pronounced, so I've left mine set at default, which is 10%. Next up we'll talk about throttle curves. So the main goal for me with the throttle curve was to make it a lot easier and smoother to hit that FOC or slow crawl range, and also make it easier to avoid bumping into the regular brushless operation when I didn't want to. I found myself getting into a bind or trying to drive through a tricky section, and the vehicle would just stutter and carry on because I was basically operating the throttle right in that range where it transitions out of slow crawl and into regular brushless. So the throttle curve, which I'll show you, makes it a lot easier to drop down into that slow crawl. Basically the first 30% of trigger throw is dedicated to that FOC range, and then from there it ramps up nicely into 100% throttle. The best way I found to do that was to use the telemetry screen, and it basically plots where your current throttle position is on your throttle curve, and you can see the RPM setting will show 0 while you're in FOC range, and as soon as you bump out of FOC and into regular brushless operation, it'll start reading an RPM. So that point where the RPM goes from 0 and starts showing you a reading, that for me was a super handy parameter to monitor whilst getting the curve set up the way I like it. There is also a toggle switch on screen just below where you set the throttle curves. If you hit that switch, it basically applies whatever throttle curve you've set up for forwards. It'll mirror that and apply it to the reverse throttle, which is how I've got mine set up. So that's my initial settings for the Lizard Pro and the Mofo RC slow motion Pancake motor. Those settings have made the truck a lot smoother and a lot more enjoyable to drive. If you're new to the Furitek brushless systems like I am and have had similar frustrations, hopefully this video sheds a little bit of light on the subject and gives you some ideas on what settings to play with. If you've got any questions or comments or want to share some of your own Furitek settings, leave them in the comments section below. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll catch you on the next video.